Welcome to Art Books on Tape. Thank you for joining us once again. This week we talked to Jessica Hundley about the book Dennis Hopper, Photographs, 1961 to 1976. It's a great opportunity, a lot of great stories from Jess talking about her time with Dennis. Let's get started. Welcome to Art Books on Tape. This week, we have the wonderful Jessica Hundley. How are you, Jess? Thanks for coming.
I'm good. How are you, Nick?
I'm good. You know, I'm hanging in there. It's springtime, summer, and the garden's pretty crazy.
It's hump day.
It's hump day. It is technically hump day. Yeah. Oh, I'm ready for like the summer festival season to start and everything to kind of get leisurely again. Late nights of
always
light
leisurely.
time. Always leisurely. Exactly. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about what book are we talking about today, Jess?
Today we are going to talk about The Many Worlds of Dennis Hopper, which is a book I did with Taschen Publications, and also obviously with Mr. Hopper. Yeah.
So this is, to clarify, this is Dennis Hopper, the actor.
The actor, and also the incredible sort of visionary director and icon and amazing photographer, which is what the book is.
A lot of people don't really realize the fact, but he kind of was an artist before he was a actor. Right?
He started taking photos on the set of Giant.
Okay.
Or no, I'm sorry, on the set of Giant. So he was in Rebel Without a Cause. That was one of his first films. He was, I believe, about 19 years old. He signed with Warner Brothers. In those days, studios had a basically functioned like a record label. They had actors who signed to them that only did their movies. He signed to Warner Brothers to do Rebel Without a Cause and met James Dean. And they became inseparable brothers. And James Dean gave Dennis a camera and said that he should start shooting him pictures if he ever wanted to direct, that he should start honing his visual style. So he was told to shoot photographs by James Dean.
Crazy. That's a pretty good story to go to.
Mm-hmm. And so he did.
So he was really kind of one of those guys that came into it as an actor and then just dove into the art scene. Because I'm used to hearing all these stories of him being at all these parties and artist parties, and he was a lot of times the connector, or at least maybe I'm wrong, but he seems like he was the connector between that 60s, 70s, 80s celebrities with the kind of artists of those days.
Absolutely, yeah. He was. One of the things that he said to me when we were doing this book, I was lucky enough to work on this with him while he was still with us here on the plane of reality. He's in the astral plane now. But he said to me that when he got this job, he grew up in Kansas and then moved to San Diego and got involved with theater as a high school student. When he signed to Warner Brothers, one of the sort of pacts he made with himself was that as being fortunate enough to have this job in art, that he would make sure he was continually curious not only about acting, but about books and music and the art world. So he started collecting art really early on. He was one of the first major collectors of 20th century art. He was super involved in the art scene in California in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, all throughout his life. But he really was a central kind of force in creating the art scene here in LA during a really special period when the Ferris Gallery and Wallace Berman and Walter Hobson, all these incredible artists were working.
That's what I was going to ask. Is if you could even name who were those artists, because that's
well, some of the artists, and part of the book is his portraits of these people, which are very intimate portraits. He kind of was a very unlike you would think based on his kind of persona. He was a very sort of quiet, a little bit shy person, I think, at first when he was at this time in his life and sort of was hiding behind the camera, and it kind of gained him entree into these worlds. So he took pictures of everyone from David Hockney to Andy Warhol to Ed Ruscha to Wallace Berman to Billy Al
Bankston.
Yeah.
That's great. So it's, I mean, because I'm sure that's got to be interesting for him as an actor, and really, working on a plane where he's interacting with hundreds of thousands of people in terms of how he influences them and is an icon to these people, and then to be in the same room and even have relationships with these other people who other people in other circles have as icons, and I think that's something that's always was really interesting to me, is the fact that everybody knew he was famous, but who do the famous people hang out with?
Well, it's funny because at this time, he really wasn't famous. He had a small part in Rebel Without a Cause. He had a pretty large part in Giant, and he had been in a couple other films and television shows, but he wasn't the Dennis Hopper, quote unquote, that we know now. Mm-hmm. He was married to Brooke Hayward, whose father was sort of Hollywood royalty, had owned a studio. So he was sort of in a really sort of mover and shaker Hollywood scene, but he was not famous, and neither really were these artists. These were his friends. These were people that were doing stuff in LA. It was the scene in LA at the time, especially on the West Side in Venice. A lot of the galleries were there, and in Topanga, where Wallace Berman had his house. And it was a very sort of tight-knit community of creative people who were all young and all doing stuff, and a lot of them would later become hugely famous. But his photos, particularly of Andy Warhol, Andy Warhol's first solo show was not in New York. It was in Los Angeles.
Wasn't it in like Pasadena or something like that?
It was actually at the Ferris Gallery.
Oh, okay.
I'm not totally certain on that, but I'm almost positive it was at the Ferris Gallery. And after the after party for Andy Warhol's first solo show was at Dennis Hopper's house.
Crazy.
And he showed me, he had the invites that they sent out, and but the pictures of Andy Warhol particularly, it's really amazing because he's so young, mm-hmm. and he has none of his persona formed yet. So they're very sweet and vulnerable.
So this is almost like the influence for all of that icon Hollywood camera stuff of Warhol, mm-hmm. in a lot of ways. It's mm-hmm. That trip of going out there, seeing all these stars and celebrities, and mm-hmm. realizing the influence that they had.
Mm-hmm. He also was in a very early Warhol film that was filmed in his backyard, in awesome. Dennis's backyard.
Of course.
He was just an integral part of the scene, documenting it. Mm-hmm. So the book is from 61 to 67, which really was a period where he was he was working as an actor, but he was studying acting. He was living part-time in New York and part-time in LA, and sort of documenting his life. And really, in a lot of the images, you can see his eye beginning to develop, which he would later bring to his directorial debut, which was Easy Rider, which was 1969. So he was taking photos sometimes on set. There's some beautiful photos of Mexico. He was in a Western with John Wayne and Dean Martin, and that was shot in Mexico. And a lot of the landscape images from that, really, you can sort of see the Easy Rider kind of eye.
Sure, where he's seeing that aesthetic, picking up on those things. Mm-hmm. So what are the sections of the book, so to speak?
There are a section that's sort of about L.A. He has a very famous photo called Double Standard that is sort of very similar to the Ed Ruscha image of it's actually the intersection at Santa Monica and
this is
Holloway.
The great one with the rearview mirror in the frame too,
it's a
right?
rearview mirror with the gas station sign.
Absolutely, yeah. Old Hollywood kind of thing,
And Hollywood there's a lot of that. There's a lot of street scenes, a lot of Hollywood, what he was doing, sort of pop art photography in some ways. There was billboards and graffiti and really great sort of images of LA and that are sort of street scenes, really capturing the era. Some with people. There's an amazing photo of kids playing on a stoop in New York and Harlem. It looks like West Side Story. It looks like it's like.
Well, I mean, but that's what's so interesting to me is like, him understanding, participating in both of these worlds, these really tight-knit artist communities, but at the same time wanting to take that aesthetic or things that he learned and then influence millions of people through movies and through these, platforms with larger distribution, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's what's really great in terms of like seeing the work and seeing it really being him observing these people and seeing what they live in and how he can make that more beautiful.
The bulk of the book really is these amazing portraits. Not even portraits; they're more intimate snapshots with pretty much every major artist working at that in the pop art period. And then there's of course a lot of wonderful photos of his friends who are actors, of Gene Stockwell and Jane Fonda, and of on set, being on set, sort of behind the scenes photos. There's a lot of amazing photos of some of the musicians. There's a Jefferson Airplane photo. There's a wonderful Grateful Dead series. He was commissioned for a minute to do some music photos for, I think, Vogue at the time. So there's some sort of more standard like band photography with the Byrds.
Sure.
But the images of the artists were really taken because he was hanging out with his friends.
Yeah. And that was like, lifestyle, what they were doing, what they were wearing, where they were. It wasn't set up for editorial. It wasn't anything other than them.
Yeah.
Which is great.
At the same time that he was doing these images and getting to know these people, he was also, of course, collecting their art, which left him, at the end of his life with really just one of the most fantastic collections of 20th century art, really, that in a private collection that there is in the world. It's now, I think, divvied up to different,
organizations.
Yeah. But if you go to his good friend, Henry Geldsheimer was the curator for the Met. There's a lot of photos of him in the book, and he was the curator for the 20th century collection at the Met in New York. And if you go to that and see that collection, pretty much every artist represented in that collection, Dennis had something of. So really, and this goes all the way. Obviously he was in the Basquiat movie. He was good friends with Julian Schnabel. Julian Schnabel did a broken plate portrait of Dennis. Julian actually curated the exhibit here of the photos at the MoCA. But it's pretty incredible. You'd go to his house and really it was like walking to the wing at the Met.
Yeah, what was your favorite part about doing the book? It sounds like that would be my favorite part, is just seeing his collection and, getting to look at pieces that I'd only even heard about or seen in an art history book.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's interesting making, as a journalist and an editor, making art books particularly are interesting, especially when you have when you get to hang out with the person and they're still around and there to work with. You can
see their personality.
And he had actually, this project had been stalled quite a few times. It was spearheaded by his gallerist, Tony Schifrazi, and who had been holding on to the photo archive. He had actually taken away from Dennis in the 70s because he thought Dennis would lose it or burn it or blow it up or... he literally went to New Mexico where Dennis was living and stole all of his contact sheets to keep them in safekeeping, and had been keeping them for many years.
I wonder how long it took Dennis to realize that it was all gone. Was it like kind of one of those things where 2 months later he was like, "Hey,
I
someone
don't
took
think
all," or was it like the day after?
I mean, I think Tony, told him,
"Hey,
I'm gonna hang on to
BT
these.
Dubs, I've got your entire archive in case you were looking for it."
I think he knew that. I mean, I think he knew that he had taken
Sure,
it, but
sure.
so it had been spearheaded by Tony and brought to Tashin. Tashin had gone through several editors. There's a lot of big personalities involved with
Sure.
this project.
Always.
Walter Hopps had done a couple essays before he had passed away, luckily. So there's a wonderful essay from Walter Hopps, who was, for those who don't know, was really one of the premier curators in Los Angeles, curated the Pasadena Museum of Art. And
talk about, maybe talk a little bit about Dennis's and Walter's relationship.
they were dear friends, and they, worked together, really. I think Dennis was very much a connector, and he was very much someone who was one of those people who's like, oh, you two should know each other. I'll have a dinner at my house, and you can meet, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Maybe we should stop.
yeah.
And we're back.
Hi.
Hi.
So connector. He was a connector. You were asking me what I like best, and I was telling you a little bit about just coming onto the project. And when I was asked to do the project, of course, I jumped at the opportunity. But I had been a huge Dennis Hopper fan, and I kind of promised myself I would suck every drop of experience and wisdom out of my time with him. And when I first met him, he was very, this is Tony's project. I don't know if anyone really cares about these images. It was originally supposed to be a 3-month contract where I would come in for 3 months and sort of help sort through all the images.
And at this point, those images you had seen, and you'd seen the icons
I had
that
started
he had taken pictures of.
I had started to look through the photographs, and what was supposed to be a 3-month contract actually turned into a 2.5-year project.
Amazing. Of just looking through contact sheet after contact sheet after
He began finding more and more.
Of course, always.
His house out in Venice was sort of legend and huge, and had actually 2 different houses, and just filled with art. And it wasn't like he was a hoarder, but he definitely was someone who kept everything. Mm-hmm. So he would find a contact sheet in a drawer, and I think as the project progressed, he began to kind of come, to the realization that, yes, these were actually pretty incredible images, and yes, people would care about them, and then became more and more involved in the project. At which point I suggested that that there be substantial amount of text in the book. Mm-hmm. So as a result, the book is set up where there's some really wonderful introductory essays by Tony Shafrazi and Walter Hopps, and then you're sort of in it, the sections of the book, which are sort of landscape and portraits and travel and music and film and art, and then there's a wonderful index that has quotes from either Dennis or someone that's in the portrait. Mm-hmm. Or Tony talking about the image. So you almost get a verbal sort of dialogue to go with every image in the back in the index.
Amazing.
And then there's a 200-page biography, which is all culled from hours and hours of interviews that I did with him, and also a filmography. So it's about half of it is quotes. It's sort of written almost as a Q&A.
So it's just long amounts of time of just
recording conversations with him, and him talking about his life, and talking about the images and where he was at that period of his life. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting because at the time when the book came out, there was a release party at the Shafrazi Gallery in New York. And I would say it was probably about 2 or 3 months after that he found out he had cancer, and unfortunately, within a year, had passed away. So it really was incredible. I mean, I got to be with him in these last 2 years, and really, I think the book is an amazing documentation, not of his whole career, but certainly of a really integral period to him as an artist.
And then, I mean, were you showing these photos that he had taken to these people and then getting quotes?
Yeah.
So you were, I mean, like that to me seems so interesting and important, is the fact that you were actually like reliving these memories with him and then calling these people up and almost reminding them of those experiences and getting their side of the story of like, whoa, wait, oh yeah, oh man, I didn't even remember about that until X, Y, and Z. Wow, that must have been phenomenal, because you're actually getting to really see both sides of the story at that point.
Yeah. And I mean, Dennis, I think, always had his camera at that time. He was on the scene, and he was everybody. One of the best things I think about these images, I mean, Dennis had an incredible eye. He was a great photographer. But it also, you're used to seeing images of these people that are very staged, that they're studio portrait shots, or they're being done for a magazine or for promotion. And they obviously had a relationship and felt comfortable. As I said, the Warhol shots are just mind-blowing because they're so open and innocent, and there's none of his shtick is happening,
No,
and
he's not hanging out in his ivory tower, so to speak. Yeah,
he's just not being Warhol. He wasn't Warhol yet. He was just Andy.
He's still Andy, yeah.
So there's a real intimacy in the images that is really incredible to see. But they're also beautiful images, composition-wise.
And that there's so much to who the photographer is in any image, and the fact that he was, as you're saying, getting into his acting career. Those beginning movies were still incredibly important movies for their time. So I'm sure it was like they were kind of both starstruck by each other. And I always love watching people take pictures of people and get their picture taken, and like seeing the social cues that pop up. So just those images are so special because of that. It's these people with mutual creative respect for each other creating something.
And getting back to what you asked me,
sure.
My favorite thing about the whole project and the 2 years of doing it was getting to know Dennis a little bit, and really. He was really just even, he was 72 years old and still so, I would come in and we'd talk about, having just watched The Wrestler, or like it's this motorcycle trip he'd taken, or an art show he'd just gone to. He was so incredibly curious still, and that sort of promise he had made to himself was still very much a part of who he was. He was really respectful and enthusiastic and encouraging and supportive of other people's art, and very humble about his own, but very just really interested in the world around him. Sure. And I think that's something that obviously is an obvious wisdom and obviously an attitude we should all have, but it's something I think people forget, us particularly as they get older. He was not bitter. He was just in love with the world.
A true bon vivant. And so tell me about the end of this book. Like, how did you wrap up this whole journey of his work, of this documentary stuff, these portraits, and what was it that kind of put the finish the book and put the period at the end of the sentence, so to speak?
I think it's more. I'm really glad it was a last-minute addition, more or less, not last minute, but it was an addition that I suggested and Dennis agreed to, which was to do a lot more text than is normal for an art book. Certainly a lot more text than Taschen usually does, and really do a biography, a full sort of interesting biography. Of course, it's a picture book biography.
Of course,
there's a lot of really amazing images in there, and the filmography. So it sort of made a very cohesive kind of statement about his life. And I feel like the images that you experience before you get to that part of the book really were really formative years. He was very young. He's in his early 20s when he took these pictures. The book is a representation of him finding his voice, really.
Yeah.
And finding his
having some
family
space to reflect on that whole part of his life as well. And get to relive that, which is I guess what anybody would want to do.
And the filmography and the biography go all the way till we stopped. It goes, and there's, Waterworld in there.
Sure. That's actually one of my favorite movies. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to put that out there right now. But that's an amazing thing. And I can imagine there'd be so much of a story to tell in the sense where he wasn't just an artist. He wasn't just an actor. And so often in our worlds these days, we want to just put people within these specific cues. Like, oh, don't try to be anything more than that because I don't want to have to worry about it or try to think about it. But so it's you got to tell that story of who he was, what influenced him, and why he did that. So everybody check out the book. It's an amazing book. Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming, Jess.
Thank you for having me.
And hopefully you'll come back soon and tell us about another awesome book that you're working on.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Jess, thank you so much for coming in. That was a great episode. Thanks for telling us the stories about Dennis and what it was like to make a book with him. As always, brought to you by This Is Not a Pipe, recorded in the Green Street Studios. This is Art Books on Tape. Thank you, everyone.